Hello, guys. Welcome to the Exploring Infinity podcast. It's been roughly 14 months since we did our first podcast. Since then, everyone has been caught up. Life has taken its toll and all that. But finally, we've gotten around to doing episode number 2. I'm Advait, by the way, joined today by Siddharth and Abhinav. Abhinav, who's primarily responsible for getting this done, he just said, come, let you just sit down and record this podcast. So you guys want to introduce yourself?
Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Abhinav here. I'm not going to make too much of an intro, but on this episode, I'm a guest. Let's see if I'm one of the future hosts. Let's see how this shit goes. But happy to be here, man.
Great to have you, man. Guest and host.
Hey guys, I'm Siddharth. If you're one of the 3 people who heard our previous episode, you should be remembering my voice. But I'm yet to find out what the topic of this episode is. So definitely as excited as you guys are.
So Abhinav, you want to do the honors? Let us know what the topic.
So the topic of this podcast, I don't know if this is going to be a recurring theme, but we try to do these topics impromptu so that we can talk about stuff on the spot. None of this is planned. None of this is scripted. So you guys are probably going to enjoy this as much as we are recording it. The topic of this episode is going to be life in the simulation today as well as tomorrow. And what I really want to talk about is what is life really like today in this simulation we're living in? And what is life going to be like in 2030 in this same simulation? Like what changes?
So Abhinav, this is something I think both me and Siddharth hold close to our hearts as a topic. Yeah. Just wanted to clarify, when you're saying simulation, are you talking something like the Matrix, where everyone's plugged in, and they're living in a virtual world, but their real bodies are elsewhere? Or are you talking about something else?
I mean, I feel like if we knew the true nature of what the simulation is, the simulation mystery would be broken and we would stop. I feel like we would kill ourselves or whatever the equivalent is. Like we would exit.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the things we can actually discuss as well. Like, what is the nature of this simulation? Is it like VR? Is it an immersive game that you're in that you really can't take the headset off? Or is it something else?
I remember watching this video by Alan Watts once where he puts it very simply. If you look at the history of civilization and if you look at a lot of the inventions that we have made, it's all about simulating something, like whether it's radio, where we wanted to enjoy fantasy, but in audio form. Then we invented cinema, which is again fantasy. And now closer to the modern era, we have invented computers and we've invented video games, and now video games are getting as realistic as possible. It seems the natural progression is towards building out this fantasy world, and I guess if technology truly holds no limits in the future, it makes complete sense that we just end up in some form of virtual reality or virtual simulation. Who knows? We definitely might already be in one, right? So what do you guys think?
Yeah, I think it's really a matter of computation power in that case, because if you look at the pattern, right, it's when we invented computers, initially computers could do text, command line. Eventually you could do photos as well, then videos, and then higher forms of media. And then the same pattern sort of repeated with computers, then the internet, smartphones. You could just send SMSs. You could then send photos. You could start clicking photos. You had camera phones. Now you have these composite media types, which are like apps. And the bigger thing that we're building is maybe VR, maybe full spaces you can be in. And I don't know if, like, one thing I'm thinking about is maybe the singularity. One way to define it could just be that the amount of computation we can do just keeps increasing till the point where we have enough computing power to simulate the universe we're currently in. And then shit just ends. Like, that's it. It's over. What do you think about that?
Sid, any thoughts?
I think there's a distinction we have to draw. And if you look at the movie Matrix, right, one key difference it had was that the consciousness that was then rechanneled or repurposed into the simulation was existing before the simulation. So there were just human bodies with brains and with consciousnesses, and that consciousness was repurposed into the matrix, into a simulation. So the simulation did not create the consciousness, as opposed to something I think closer to what we're discussing here and what Nick Bostrom talks about and Elon Musk talks about is a scenario where we believe that digitally, or whatever would be the apt word, we could actually simulate a consciousness itself and
But then,
generate.
how would you define a consciousness in this case? Then I don't see the difference between the two.
I think the for me personally, that's actually the only thing that's known for certain. The absolutely only thing that's known for certain is that it feels like something to be me. And that's a bit of a syllogistic argument, but and that applies to each of us. Everything else we may learn from science, from people, from elaborate networks and systems, and including religion, even drugs. But one thing you absolutely know for sure is that for some reason it feels like something to be you, that it feels like you're something. So the question of are we living in a simulation is, I think, equivalent to the question of can a consciousness be generated from within this system or universe?
So let me give you guys another analogy, and you can tell me what you think about this. I don't personally think consciousness is like a special thing. What I believe is that, like, one way to think about it, we're engineers. Consciousness is the primary key for the thing we're living out right now. When you design systems, like let's say when you're at a company, your employee ID is your primary key. In any other system, certain primary keys are the things that define you. I feel like the thing we're living right now, the primary key is consciousness. If we manage to create simulations, let's say VR, which is indistinguishable from real life, the primary key there might be your identity. It might be a different thing. I don't know what we call it, but I think that's what I'm thinking about.
Abhinav, I have a slightly different take on the computational analogy. Instead of primary keys, I tend to think of it more in terms of instances, right? Instantiation of the one fundamental thing. And for me, that's sort of a pathway to combining spirituality along with this whole paradigm of simulation and VR, etc. I don't know what you guys think.
Like if I just wanted to continue on that trend, I would have stated something like, and I think about spirituality and hallucinogenic drugs as somehow getting access to global variables.
Yeah.
I think what this shows more is about the fact that our frameworks and tools for understanding the world, as they evolve, we keep interpreting the world and the universe in through those means. But for me personally, I still haven't found any argument that can convince me that a subsystem of the universe can somehow generate the ability to witness and observe the rest of the universe. And I'm worried if whether such an argument can even be made. So, Abhinav, when you said earlier the example you gave, did you kind of imply that you think consciousness cannot be generated? Is that the point? Like, is it matrix of simulation we're talking about?
What I'm saying is consciousness is just one of the variables of this current thing we're living in. If we were living a different thing, which is, let's say we go to a higher simulation, the main variable, like I'm calling that primary key, not technically accurate, but the main variable might be something else. It might be super consciousness. That's what I mean. I feel like we don't need to generate consciousness. We just need to find what the main variable of the next simulation is to move to it.
So I have a slightly, tangential point to make, just actually in support of the fact that we might actually be living in a simulation. I was reading a couple of papers, actual scientific papers, which talk about the constraints that we have in this universe, right? Like there are these constants, like gravity, universal gravitation, speed of light, as possibly constraints of an information processing system. Like if we imagine this entire universe to be a processing system, right? It could be some form of a quantum computer. Then the limits that we see in transfer rates, like the speed of light and information transfer rates, could actually be limits on the computer which is actually contained within us. So, I mean, I haven't really
Definitely.
into the technical details, but it's very
Definitely, man. Like personally, to me, there's no debate. Is it a simulation or not? It is. Like it's like it's like you can either logic it out and eventually you believe it or you stop thinking about it, or you just have that intuition through whatever some direct experience, and you're like, yeah, okay, I'm okay with this.
So I think on this particular episode I'll be able to provide the opposing counsel,
Yeah.
but I find the exact argument you're making. I find that it's perfectly reversible in the sense that it seems so. There's a fundamental assumption, and that's the question I asked before: can consciousness be generated in any format and by a subsystem?
But
And
does it
I'm just
matter?
returning to that point
My question
because
is, does it matter?
I think it fundamentally does, because if it cannot be generated, then the only type of simulation I can find possible is the matrix type, because you're repurposing simulation. And if it can be generated, then practically 100% certain that it is a simulation. So I'm
No, I'll
saying
tell
that,
you. So
yeah.
I'll tell you what, right? The way I'm thinking about it is, we humans have a life and we have consciousness as the thing. Um, Plants and animals don't necessarily have the same type of consciousness, maybe, but they're still living a life as a character in a certain world, which is why I don't personally place an importance on the concept of a consciousness.
So I guess the difference there would be sentience. Like uh, I think Ken Wilber talks a lot about these degrees of consciousness. He says that even rocks can have consciousness. I think he defines it more in terms of information processing. But I guess there's a lot more levels of depth to it than that.
Yeah, because I mean, if we look at it even in terms of uh, the integrated information processing, I forget the name, but one of the kind of famous research papers on this topic, uh, it there seems to be a fundamental, not necessarily an assumption, but a movement where most of scientific belief is around the fact that to some degree consciousness is fundamentally reducible. And I and yet we don't really seem to have any understanding of where that comes from. So it's difficult to predict whether at some point uh, we can even develop such an understanding or not. But there is something that is not functionally reducible about the fact that right now you're sitting here and you're either listening to this podcast, and it feels like something to just listen to it. Like, in fact, if you meditate pretty strongly or you take the right type of drugs, it becomes possible to witness even when there are absolutely no contents of consciousness. There are no thoughts, there's absolutely no sensory input in terms of vision or audio. There's basically no form of input, and yet it is possible to observe. And that's
Yeah.
a sensation of, that's an experience that most people don't have, because it takes quite a bit of effort to get to that point. But through that experience, I find it even more difficult to develop an understanding where that is functionally reducible. Like, how can individual pieces, or even almost all of the universe, but not like less than 100% of the universe, generate a system where it feels like something to observe the rest of this universe, even without any contents? And so that's something I still struggle with. And I know Abhinav has clearly stated that it's for him at least obvious. I find it the exact opposite, which is that the natural assumption is that consciousness is obviously functionally not reducible, and then we have to do a lot of work to try to figure out if maybe
Do you,
it is.
do you think a lot of this comes down to us not being able to compare states of consciousness? In the sense that a plant has certain, let's say we're calling this awareness, the ability to observe. we're just not able to translate this between um, different entities, plants, animals, fungi, us,
Yeah.
let's say a character in a game, or let's say the bits, like the zeros and ones in our in the systems we create. Like we're not able to translate that observation, and maybe that's one of the reasons why we think we're the only ones who can do it.
So I
So,
actually feel that you know there are different kinds of systems, and I think the systems we are specifically talking about are complex systems, and inherently all complex systems have very fundamental characteristics. They all are composed of simple components relative to the whole system, but yet they interact in non-linear ways to generate behavior, which is complex. Like it's
There are no
synergy.
simple systems.
Uh,
Advait, there are no simple systems.
no, you can talk about like a simple system like adding up two numbers, like a simple adder in a computer.
No, but it's still a part of a bigger system of
It's
mathematics.
yeah, that's true. I mean, there are subsystems and larger systems, but I'm talking about
Hmm.
complex systems where like a neural network or
Hmm.
like the immune system or economics, like the economy of human civilization, something like that. So there are systems which have emergent behavior, like the properties of the system as a whole are larger than if you average or you sum up the properties of the individual components. And
Yeah.
I don't know if consciousness could be something like that. It could be an emergent phenomenon of so many neurons interacting, and something new is coming out of it, which an individual neuron is able to experience. How would that neuron feel? Maybe like that, humanity or all sentient life are forming a complex system where each individual is a node, and maybe Siddharth, what you're talking about as the fundamental experience, right? Maybe it could be just the super experience of each node in that large system.
Hmm. I think I like that train of thought actually. Another way like I would describe it is the all systems are network based systems,
Yeah.
right? Whether you're talking about neural systems, you're talking about us, you're talking about plants, you're talking about animals. We're all network based beings, and our consciousness is just our experience or ability to observe how we feel in this network. And for a different entity, that experience is different. I don't know if that made sense.
yeah.
But
Uh,
think about yes,
Yeah, so along similar lines, right? There's a parallel between uh, there's an analogy that Alan Watts used to use, which is kind of I'm probably paraphrasing it very poorly, but imagining a large football field, and
Hmm.
it's pretty much pitch dark, and you have a flashlight, right? So if you point it downwards and you put it pretty close to the ground, you'll get a almost decent circle of light, and that is very it has relatively clear boundaries. It's you can't get 100% accuracy, but you can
Hmm.
kind of see where the boundaries are. And as you move this flashlight away, at some point it will cover the whole field in the same light, but the intensity of that light will be very low. So it kind of the explanation used is that the ability to observe is equivalent to the ability to exclude. And
Hmm.
a similar argument was used. I'm sad that I'm not able to recall that paper on integrated information theory, but a similar argument was used in that paper as well, which is basically what is the difference between a diode and a human being, both of whom are only differentiating between whether there is a light on a screen or not. And the resolution to this argument kind of scenario was that a diode can only differentiate, like the complete set of instances that it can uh, kind of pass through is a set
Hmm.
which contains no light and yes light. That's it. There's only two events. Whereas a human being who's exposed to a screen on which light can be on or off is his set is much larger. It covers no light, yes light, red, blue, I'm feeling sad, and 10 other things, right? So the fact that the a human being is able to exclude from a much larger set is what corresponds to him having a higher consciousness. At least this is the argument that was used, right? I don't know how that plays into this.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that just means that as we evolve, we're just getting into the bigger sets. That's all. That's what it's all about.
So I think coming back to the main point, I think the debate we are having now is about whether it's a brain in a what or a digital mind which an AI sort of created. But even if it's either of those, I think the conclusion is that we are still in a simulation. And
Yeah, I mean, the words don't matter. The words are what we call it.
but my one question is it inevitable? Like maybe the guys who created the simulation, uh, you know, started the simulation to understand whether they would get to a simulation, because fundamentally systems like these are non-tractable in the sense that you can't just run it forward at 50x speed and be able to predict, because that's the number one rule of chaotic systems like weather systems, right? Sensitive dependence on initial conditions. So maybe the only way, like imagine us, like if we want to know how civilization actually pans out, the only way for us to actually figure it out would be to start a simulation and see and run it forward. So in maybe slightly different time. So is it inevitable is my question. Like whatever we do, we are gonna end up in deeper layers of virtual reality or immersive reality.
Definitely, man, definitely. Because I feel like we are already we are doing the simulations already. We
Yeah.
try to figure out what happens, when you give these conditions to this kind of entity. And I feel like we, like as human beings, we need that meaning. Like we're like, yeah, we hope, like we hope this universe is being run for some nice experiment, haha. But like, truly, there could be no meaning. I mean, there could be a chance where this is just like one of the 100 of another 100 of the simulations this one programmer is running at his desk.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
But I think something which should be interesting is how should we live our lives accepting this as truth. I think Abhinav, you had some experience in this regard. Like how do you go about living your life?
I
Knowing
mean,
this.
you go about it. So it depends on what your viewpoint is, right? If your viewpoint is that God created us, you live your life honoring God. If your viewpoint is that um, we're in this system and it doesn't make sense, that viewpoint affects how you live, you know. But personally, to me, the way I believe it is that we're all network based beings. We are creating networks, the internet and other things. And the best way to live our life is just to honor the networks we're in. And, new networks are created. You're a part of networks already. Your workplace, the online platforms you're a part of, the WhatsApp groups you're a part of. And the way to live your life is to honor these networks. That's what I feel.
So that
Yeah. Firstly, I'm still not sure how we ended up concluding that this is. But let's just skip over that part.
accepted, bro.
In terms of ethical implications, I think that's kind of a moot point to me, probably because of the same fundamental concept, which is that if it feels like something to be Advait, right? Now, whether God created the world, whether it is this kind of functionally reducible physical world, uh, or it's some other kind of spiritual story, but in which simulation is not possible. One thing that a fundamental parameter based on which my ethics has to be decided is if in my interactions with Advait, can Advait suffer? Right? And if it is true that Advait can suffer, then irrespective of the larger concept that I imagine, and all these words are basically to some degree imaginations, what I cannot reduce is the fact that Advait suffers, when I do whatever this action. So
Why not?
sorry,
Why not?
because he's suffering, right?
Okay, and so what?
So suffering is, I think, the one thing that unites all consciousness. So if I know that it feels excessively negative from the perspective of that person, I think that is the kind of the railroads on which we can build the ethics on top of that. So irrespective of whether it's a simulation or not, what we are experiencing is basically the same, right? So as long as that stays constant, and if that changes, of course, you need a different answer. But as long as that stays constant, I think the ethics implied is also consistent with that knowledge.
The reason I say we're network-based beings, right, is that the ethics are defined by the network you're in the sense that literally based on the country you were born in, your code of conduct or like whatever you want to call these rules is different. So I don't think there's one global ethics thing, although we would like to believe, and there are some things which are global, but I feel like that comes down to the network you're a part of. I mean, honestly, we could all be talking about the exact same thing, but with different words.
Yeah. I just thought of a point. I think it's a bit late to the conversation, but Abhinav, you had mentioned that we find some difficulty in seeing from the perspective of other, let's say, like micro consciousnesses, like a plant, or maybe even other human beings, and we genuinely can't see from their perspective. If it is true that basically along the lines of Ken Wilber that everything has at least some amount of consciousness, I think games are an interesting example, because when you're playing Counter-Strike, there are moments where you're extremely aware that you are playing it, like you're more identified with the player of the game. And there are other moments where you're so involved, especially when it reaches around 3 a.m. in the morning, that you almost, at least for brief phases, you almost completely identify with the character you're playing.
Yeah.
Forget. So I think we have at least a little bit of experience in that dimension as well.
Yeah, man, I feel that with movies as well, right? For example, movies or TV series. You forget you exist. You're just watching. Um, if that's the same case with games, I don't think we're far from, you know, a point in time where, it's us living in a new simulated reality, which is as good as real life. And we just stop thinking about the shit outside. We're just like, okay, this is my life now.
Yeah, I think that future is definitely coming. It's like a mix of Wall-E and Neuralink.
Yeah.
We'll be plugged in and just never suffer. But best of luck with that. But let's see how it goes.
Yeah, man. Honestly, I feel like that's what I'm waiting for.
Like, I feel it's sort of inevitable because I think overall, like, our systems, our ways of living are getting screwed up exponentially in terms of because of both climate change, pollution, and a bunch of different factors. We need a separate podcast for that. I think people will need a way out, and if VR offers a way out, I think people will take it.
And we already have those ways out, right? They already exist today. It's just that they're not mainstream.
Exactly, and it's expensive.
It's not expensive, man. Like, it's playing PUBG. It's playing Fortnite.
Okay, like that.
Right?
Or taking drugs.
Yeah, like you forget the world outside. It's just that at some point you come back. But if you can just stitch together those edges, then it's done.
So then, by the way, technology is accelerating, and if VR can provide that immersive and experience, it makes sense. People will just want to stay there.
Yeah, and I feel like it's a romantic idea to say, "Oh, bro, I'll still like going to the park." No, you won't. you can have any park you want in the world. Why world? You can have any park you want in the universe. Parks that don't exist. Right?
Yeah, that's a tough argument. I'm particularly fascinated with how old school religions would kind of deal with that situation, where you could almost create a heaven or a hell right here and live it out. That's going to be interesting.
And I just had a sort of a concluding thought, at least from my side. Like Siddharth, what you mentioned about being in a movie or a game, right? Like I sometimes tend to think of it as like being in a play, and especially when you're angry or when you're sad, you realize, okay, like outside of the play, we're still friends. Inside this, you might be my sworn enemy, but if I recognize that outside of his play, he's buddies, everything becomes way more easier. So
Yeah, man.
Yeah, man.
So-
Outside of this, we're all buddies. Let's conclude with that.
so love and peace. That's the aim, and that's the outcome.
Yeah. So returning to the topic, right? I think one
Yeah,
key aspect we didn't touch upon is
we're-
so.
we're-
what would
we're just-
all this
I feel
mean
like we're just
in
waiting for the-
2030?
I feel like we've changed the title of this podcast through our conversation.
Yeah.
And otherwise, I'm going to leave it up
But
to you.
it was great having you guys on board.
New
and
title of
we
this
should
will
definitely
be.
be doing more of this. And hopefully, guys, if you're listening, really, really thankful that you are listening.
Yeah, man.
And this should definitely get better with time. So stay with us.
I feel like now we're just like in a rush to cover a lot of ground because it's the first few episodes or whatever. But everything we talk about can be a nuanced
Yeah,
discussion.
and if any of the listeners have interesting anecdotes
yeah,
or
let's
comments,
look forward to
we have an Exploring Infinity Facebook group and even a WhatsApp group, and we discuss stuff like this all the time. And it probably a lot of people would even get annoyed by it, but we'd love to hear what you think about these topics as well.